The great station called Axis Prime floated in the dead center of the galaxy like a steel moon that never slept. And on the day humanity arrived to claim its seat among the stars, nobody cared. Ambassador Elena Voss walked through the main concourse with her back straight and her hands folded behind her, and she could feel every alien eye sliding past her like she was nothing more than a stain on the polished floor. Because to them, she was exactly that, a representative of a species that had only just crawled out of its own gravity well, and dared to knock on the door of civilizations that had ruled the void for 10,000 years. The Galactic Concord was not a kind place for newcomers, and it was an even crueler place for those who came with empty hands and no legend to speak of. Elena had read the intelligence files, she had memorized every species profile, and she knew exactly what waited for her in the Grand Assembly Hall. But knowing a thing and feeling it, two very different animals, and when the doors opened and she stepped inside, the weight of 100 alien gazes hit her like a wall of cold water. The hall was enormous, carved from a pale stone that hummed with energy, and every seat was filled with representatives of the most powerful species in known space. Insectoid hive minds with clicking mandibles, gas-breathing giants encased in pressure suits, sleek aquatic beings suspended in hovering tanks of green fluid, and at the very center of the highest platform sat the Valkyrie delegation. Elena had studied them the most, because the Valkyrie were the ones who mattered in this room. They were an all-female warrior species, every single one of them standing over 7 feet tall, with skin the color of dark bronze, and bone-like plates running along their arms and spines, and their eyes burned a deep amber that seemed to glow from within like embers trapped in glass, and they moved with the kind of grace that only came from a body designed by evolution for one single purpose: to fight and to win. Their leader was war matriarch Cyrith Dahl, and she was the most decorated warrior in the known galaxy, a living legend who had led her people through 3 interstellar wars and had never once tasted defeat. And when she stood to address the assembly, every voice in the hall went silent. "We have received the petition from the species called humanity," Cyrith said, and her voice rolled through the chamber like distant thunder, deep and resonant, and utterly without warmth. "They wish to enter the crucible trials and earn military standing within the Concord." She paused, and her amber eyes found Elena in the lower gallery, and for a moment the two women looked at each other across the vast space of the hall. "I have reviewed their world," Cyrith continued. "A small planet, third from a mediocre star, covered in water they cannot breathe, and land that shakes beneath their feet. The dominant species, these humans, are soft-boned herd creatures who spent most of their history killing each other over patches of dirt and imaginary lines drawn on maps." Laughter rippled through the assembly, not from everyone, but from enough, and Elena felt her jaw tighten, but she did not move, and she did not look away. "They have no fleet worth mentioning," Cyrith went on. "No combat record beyond their own civil wars. No biological advantages that any scanner can detect. And they wish to stand in the crucible alongside species that have conquered star systems?" She shook her head slowly. "I do not object to their entry. The crucible has always been open to all. But I want it noted that the Valkyrie do not consider this a serious petition, and we will not be insulted if the humans withdraw before they are carried out on stretchers." More laughter, louder this time, and the Valkyrie warriors seated behind Cyrith joined in, their deep voices filling the hall. With a sound like rolling stones, Elena stood, and the laughter faded slightly, and she spoke in a voice that was calm and clear and carried no anger at all. "The humans accept the terms of the crucible," she said. "We will see you in the arena." That was all she said, and she sat back down, and the assembly moved on to other business, and nobody gave humanity another thought for the rest of the session. But that night, Alone in her quarters aboard the tiny human diplomatic vessel docked at Axis Prime, Elena opened a secure channel that bounced through 17 relay stations before it reached a facility buried deep beneath the Andes Mountains on Earth. And she typed a message that contained only 4 words: "Send the Suns." 6,000 light-years away, in a place that did not exist on any official map, an alarm rang through a network of underground corridors carved into the bones of the oldest mountains on the planet, and men began to move. Were not ordinary men. Task Force Fenrir was composed of 48 soldiers drawn from every corner of Earth, each one selected from the deadliest special forces lineages humanity had ever produced, and each one had been further enhanced with bio-augmentation technology that pushed the human body to the very edge of what flesh and bone could endure. Reinforced skeletal structures, accelerated healing, neural-link communication implants, and pain suppression systems that allowed them to keep fighting long after any sane creature would have collapsed. Their commander was Captain Mateo Reyes, and the men called him Lobo, which meant wolf, because he had a way of smiling before a fight that reminded them of something hungry. Mateo read the briefing on a tablet while his men assembled in the main hangar, and he read about the Valkyrie and their 200-year winning streak, and their 7-foot frames and their bone-plated skin, and when he was done, he looked up at his lieutenant, a sharp-eyed Japanese man named Kai Nakamura, and he smiled that wolf smile. "They hung a death shroud over our arena bay," Kai said, reading from his own tablet. "It is a Valkyrie tradition. They drape it over the quarters of any species they believe is too weak to survive the crucible." Mateo folded his arms and looked out at his men, scarred, quiet, and utterly unbothered by the fact that they were about to walk into a galactic tournament, where every other species was bigger, stronger, and faster than them. "Good," he said. "Let them think we are already dead." He turned to face the hangar, and his voice rose so every man could hear it. "Fenrir, pack your gear. We are going to show the galaxy what the sons of Earth are made of." And somewhere on Axis Prime, the death shroud fluttered in the recycled air, outside humanity's empty arena bay, pale and weightless and waiting for a corpse that would never come. The SSV Coronado docked at Axis Prime without ceremony, without music, and without a single representative from any alien species waiting to greet it, because nobody on the station cared enough about humanity's arrival to bother walking to the port. The ship itself was small and ugly by galactic standards, a blunt-nosed frigate painted in flat gray that looked like it had been welded together in a hurry. And when the docking clamp sealed and the airlock hissed open, the first thing the station's security sensors registered was a group of 48 human males walking in 2 neat columns through the corridor, and the sensors flagged nothing remarkable about them at all. They were short by galactic standards, none of them taller than 6 feet 2, and they were lean rather than massive, built like long-distance runners rather than the towering slabs of muscle that most warrior species produced, and they moved in silence with their bags slung over their shoulders, and their eyes scanning everything without appearing to look at anything. Captain Mateo Reyes walked at the front, with Lieutenant Kai Nakamura beside him, and behind them came Sergeant Diego Herrera, Corporal Yuki Tanaka, and the rest of Fenrir, and not a single one of them spoke a word as they made their way to the arena bay that had been assigned to humanity. The death shroud was still hanging there. Mateo looked at it for a long moment, and then walked underneath it, without touching it, and his men followed, and they set up their equipment in the bay, and began preparing as if the shroud did not exist. Word spread through the station the way it always did, fast and without mercy, and by the end of the first day, every species on Axis Prime knew that the humans had arrived, and that they were small and quiet and completely unremarkable, and the general opinion was that this would be the shortest Crucible appearance in the history of the tournament. The Crucible was not combat between species, but survival against environment, and each species drew their challenge at random from a rotating pool of simulated death traps. And when the draw was announced on every screen across the station, a murmur ran through the crowd, because humanity had drawn the Maw. The Maw was a volcanic hellscape, a massive arena chamber filled with rivers of simulated lava, collapsing rock formations, toxic gas vents, and seismic tremors that could split the ground open without warning. And in the 90-year history of the Crucible, only 4 species had ever completed it, and none of them had done it without casualties. The Velkari had drawn an Arctic survival simulation, which was difficult but well within their capabilities, and they completed it in 6 hours with clean efficiency and not a scratch on any of them. And Sireth Dal sat in the observation gallery afterward, with her arms folded and her amber eyes fixed on the screen that showed Humanity's Arena. "This will be quick," said Blade's sister Kalith, Sireth's most trusted sub-commander, a towering warrior with a scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw. "The Maw will eat them alive." Sireth said nothing and watched. Task Force Fenrir entered the Maw at 0600 station time, and the observation gallery was full because everyone wanted to see the little humans fail. And for the first 10 minutes, it seemed like that was exactly what was going to happen. The ground cracked open beneath their feet within seconds of entry, and a wall of superheated gas erupted from a vent directly in their path, and a cascade of molten rock began pouring down from a simulated volcanic shelf above them. And by every reasonable calculation, they should have scattered and panicked, the way most species did when the Maw first hit them. They did not scatter. They did not panic. Instead, something happened that made every alien in the gallery lean forward in their seats. Prep. The humans adapted. Within 30 seconds of the first eruption, Fenrir had reorganized into a fluid formation that none of the alien tacticians in the gallery had ever seen before. And they were moving, not away from the danger, but through it, using the lava flows as natural barriers to funnel their movement, using the toxic gas vents to mask their heat signatures from the arena's tracking systems, and using the collapsing terrain itself as improvised bridges and cover. They did not speak to each other, and this was the thing that disturbed the watchers the most. 48 men moved as one organism through the most lethal environment the Crucible had ever produced. And they did it in total silence, communicating through a language of micro-gestures and eye movements, and subtle shifts in body position, that was so fast and so precise that it looked like telepathy. Corporal Tanaka spotted a pattern in the seismic tremors within the first 20 minutes and used hand signals to relay the timing to the entire team. And after that, they were predicting where the ground would split before it happened, and routing around it like water flowing around stones. Sergeant Herrera led a 4-man element across a field of collapsing rock pillars by timing their jumps to the rhythm of the eruptions, and they crossed it in 45 seconds flat, without a single man falling. Captain Reyes directed the entire operation from the center of the formation, his eyes reading the terrain the way a musician reads a score, and he made decisions so fast that his men were already moving before the danger had fully formed. They completed the Maw in 3 hours and 42 minutes. The previous record had been 7 hours and 18 minutes, set by a species of silicon-based giants who were literally immune to heat. The gallery was silent. Sireth Dal did not move from her seat for a long time after the timer stopped, and her amber eyes were narrow, and her jaw was tight. And when Kalith began to speak, she held up one hand and silenced her. "Play it again," Sireth said quietly, "the section where they crossed the lava field at the 30-minute mark." The footage replayed, and Sireth watched the humans move in their silent, seamless coordination, and she saw what nobody else in the gallery had seen: the micro-gestures, the eye movements, the way the entire unit breathed and turned and flowed as one single creature with 48 bodies and one mind. "That is not training," Sireth murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "That is something deeper. That is a species that learned to hunt together before it learned to speak." Kalith frowned but said nothing, because she had never heard her war matriarch sound like that before. That night the station buzzed with talk of the humans and their impossible time. But most species dismissed it as a fluke, a combination of luck and adrenaline, and a favorable layout. And the consensus was that the real test would come in the second round, when species fought species directly. Kalith was walking through a lower corridor near the maintenance level, when she rounded a corner and nearly walked into Sergeant Diego Herrera, who was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and a calm expression on his scarred face. She stopped and looked down at him, because she was 7 feet tall, and he was 5'10", and the size difference was so absurd that she almost laughed. "You are one of the humans," she said, and it was not a question. "And you are one of the warriors who hung a death shroud over our door," Diego replied, and his voice was quiet and steady and completely without fear. Kalith stepped closer, and she poked his chest with one armored finger hard enough to push him back half a step, and she grinned with teeth that could bite through steel cable. Said, "You did well in the maw, but do not mistake survival for strength. The crucible has many teeth, and you are very small." Diego looked up at her, and his dark eyes held something that she could not name, something that was not anger, and not fear, and not bravado, but something older and quieter and far more dangerous. "On my world," he said, "the smaller the predator, the more venomous the bite." Then he pushed off the wall and walked past her without looking back, and Kalith stood in the empty corridor and felt something she had never felt before in her entire life as a warrior, a cold, creeping sensation in the pit of her stomach that she did not have a word for. Uncertainty. The next morning the second-round brackets were announced, and every screen on Axis Prime displayed them simultaneously, and the station fell into a hush that spread from corridor to corridor like a wave. Humanity versus the Velkari. First match. They beneath the death shroud that still hung from the ceiling. Captain Mateo Reyes looked at the bracket and cracked his knuckles and said to his men, "They wanted to see what we are made of. Now they will find out." The grand arena of Axis Prime could seat 200,000 spectators across 6 tiers of curved balconies carved from pale luminous stone. And on the day humanity fought the Velkari, every single seat was filled, because word had spread, and the galaxy wanted to see either a miracle or a massacre, and nobody was quite sure which it would be. The arena floor had been configured as a ruined cityscape, shattered buildings, narrow alleys, crumbling overpasses, and open plazas littered with rubble. And at each end of the map stood a raised platform where each team's standard was planted, a glowing pillar of light in the team's color, and the objective was simple: capture the enemy standard and return it to your own base, or eliminate every member of the opposing team. The rules were strict. Non-lethal weapons only, calibrated to each species' pain threshold so that every hit would hurt exactly as much as it was supposed to. Case things went wrong. The Velkari fielded their finest, the Crimson Tide, 8 warriors handpicked by Cyrith Dahl herself, each one a veteran of real wars, fought on real battlefields, each one standing 7 feet tall with bone-plated skin and legs that could launch them across a 30-foot gap in a single bound. And they entered the arena to thunderous applause from the gallery, their armor gleaming red and their amber eyes burning with the absolute confidence of a species that had not lost a crucible match in 200 years. Task Force Fenrir fielded 8 men. They walked into the arena in silence, wearing matte black tactical gear that looked almost primitive compared to the Velkari's ornate battle armor, and they carried their non-lethal weapons, pulse rifles modified for the tournament, with the easy comfort of people who had been holding weapons since before they could read. The crowd looked at them and saw 8 small, quiet, unremarkable creatures, and the betting boards across the station showed odds of 40-1 against humanity. War Matriarch Cyrith Dahl sat in the command gallery above the arena, with her sub-commanders arranged behind her. And she folded her arms and watched the countdown timer with an expression that gave nothing away. And when Caliph leaned forward and said, "This will not last long," Cyrith did not respond. The horn sounded. The Crimson Tide exploded forward with the terrifying speed their species was known for. 8 bronze blurs streaking through the ruined streets toward the human position. And they expected to find the humans holding a defensive line, the way every species did in the opening moments of a crucible match. They found nothing. The human base was empty. The 8 men of Task Force Fenrir had vanished into the city, like smoke dissolving into air. And the Crimson Tide skidded to a halt, and looked at each other, and for the first time in any of their careers faced an opponent that was simply not where it was supposed to be. What followed was not a battle in any sense the galaxy understood. It was a hunt, and the humans were the hunters. The first Valkyrie warrior fell 12 minutes into the match, when she chased what she thought was a fleeing human down a narrow alley, only to discover that the figure she was chasing was a decoy, a tactical jacket draped over a support beam, and rigged to move with a simple pulley, and by the time she realized the trick, 2 humans had dropped from the buildings on either side of her and hit her with concentrated crossfire that put her on the ground before she could turn around. The second warrior fell 8 minutes after that, lured into an open plaza by the sound of deliberate footsteps, and when she charged toward the sound, she triggered a cascade of pre-positioned pulse charges that the humans had planted during the first 60 seconds of the match, while the Valkyrie were still at the starting line. The crowd began to murmur. The Crimson Tide regrouped and tried to use their superior speed to sweep the city in coordinated patterns. But every time they established a formation, the humans broke it, not with force, but with misdirection, false retreats that pulled warriors out of position, phantom sounds that split their attention, and an endless stream of small tactical surprises that kept the Valkyrie reacting instead of acting. It was like fighting water. Every time they grabbed for it, it slipped through their fingers and reformed somewhere else. Cyrith Dahl leaned forward in her seat as the clock passed the 1-hour mark, and 5 of her 8 warriors were still standing, but visibly frustrated. And she watched the human team rotate positions with a fluidity that should not have been possible without verbal communication. And she realized that she was witnessing something that no species in the Concord had ever developed to. This degree, a collective tactical intelligence that operated below the level of conscious thought, an instinct for coordinated violence that was woven into the very DNA of these small, stubborn creatures. By the second hour, only 3 Valkyrie warriors remained active, and the humans had taken casualties of their own. 2 of the 8 had been caught and eliminated by the sheer explosive power of the Valkyrie, who managed to corner them. But the remaining 6 humans had not slowed down at all, and the crowd had gone from skeptical murmuring to stunned silence. The final confrontation happened in the central plaza of the ruined city. Blade Sister Caliph, the last of the Crimson Tide still standing, after her 2 remaining sisters were taken down in a coordinated ambush that hit them from 4 directions at once, found herself face to face with Captain Mateo Reyes in the wide open space beneath a shattered dome. She was 7 feet of bronze muscle and bone, armor and fury, and he was 5'11" of blood and bruises and something behind his eyes that she could not understand. He was hurt badly. The biomonitors visible on the gallery screens showed 3 cracked ribs, a torn ligament in his left knee, and a concussion that should have had him on the ground, and yet he stood in front of her with his weapon raised and that wolf smile on his face, as if his body's screaming pain was nothing more than background noise. They fought. Caliph was faster and stronger, and her reach was nearly double his, and she hit him with strikes that the gallery's force monitors rated as devastating, blows that connected with his torso and arms, and sent him skidding across the rubble-strewn ground, and any other creature in the galaxy would have stayed down after the first exchange. Mateo got back up. She hit him again, a sweeping kick that caught him in the ribs and launched him into a broken wall, and the crack of impact echoed through the arena, and the crowd gasped, and the medical team at the nearest exit took a step forward. Mateo got back up. There was blood on his teeth, and his left arm was hanging wrong, and his breath was coming in ragged gasps. But he got back up, and he looked at her with those dark human eyes that held no surrender in them, and he raised his fists. Caliph hesitated, and that hesitation was all it took. Because while she was processing the impossible fact that this broken creature would not stop, Mateo was reading her. He had been reading her since the first exchange, cataloging her patterns the way his ancestors had once cataloged the movements of predators on the African savanna. And by the sixth exchange, he knew her timing better than she knew it herself. He ducked under her next strike by a margin so thin that her fist grazed his hair, and he stepped inside her reach, where her height became a weakness instead of a strength. Arms around her leading leg and twisted with every ounce of enhanced strength his broken body had left. Caliph went down. The joint lock he applied used her own massive frame against her, leveraging her weight and height into a hold that pinned her face down on the ground, with her arm bent at an angle that her species had no counter for, because no one had ever been close enough and strong enough and insane enough to try it. She struggled, and she was powerful enough to break free from almost anything. But every time she shifted, he adjusted, reading her movements before she completed them. And after 11 seconds, she slammed her free hand on the ground, the Valkyrie signal for yield. The arena was silent for 3 full heartbeats. Then it erupted. 200,000 aliens rose to their feet, and the sound that poured from them was not cheering exactly, but something raw and more primal. It was the sound of a galaxy watching its assumptions shatter. In real time, the remaining Fenrir operatives sprinted to the Valkyrie standard and captured it, and the match was officially over, and the clock read 3 hours and 14 minutes, and the Valkyrie had lost a crucible match for the first time in 2 centuries. Medics rushed the arena floor, and every single human was injured. Broken bones, torn muscles, internal bleeding, concussions. They had fought through all of it, every last one of them. And a Valkyrie medic who was treating Captain Reyes looked at his bio readings and then looked at her colleague and whispered in a voice that shook. His body was failing the entire time. His organs were shutting down from accumulated trauma, and he simply refused to stop. Cyrith Dahl descended from the command gallery. The crowd went quiet as she walked across the arena floor, her boots crunching on rubble, and she stopped in front of Mateo Reyes, who was sitting on a chunk of broken concrete with blood running down his face, and his cracked ribs visible on the medical scanner that a human medic was pressing against his side. She looked down at him for a long moment. Then she spoke in the old Valkyrie tongue, a phrase that had not been used in living memory, a phrase from the ancient warrior codes that predated spaceflight, and her voice carried across the silent arena. Vel Murai Kesh. Her sub-commanders behind her went rigid with shock, because the phrase meant, "I see a warrior," and it had not been spoken to a non-Valkyrie in over 1,000 years. Cyrith reached down and removed her ceremonial gauntlet, a piece of armor that represented her personal honor and her lineage, and she placed it on the ground at Mateo's feet. He looked at the gauntlet and then looked up at her, and he did not smile and he did not gloat, and the only thing in his eyes was the quiet acknowledgement of one fighter recognizing another. "Thank you," he said. Humanity's arena bay. Someone quietly took down the death shroud. The galaxy did not know what to do with humanity after the Crucible match. And so it did what galaxies always do when something unexpected happens. It panicked quietly and sent diplomats. within 48 hours of Task Force Fenrir's victory over the Velkari. 17 species that had never once acknowledged Earth's existence suddenly wanted to talk about trade agreements and cultural exchanges and mutual defense pacts. And Ambassador Elena Voss found herself fielding more calls in a single day than she had received in the entire previous year. And she handled each one with the same calm professionalism that had kept her standing in the assembly hall when Sirith Dal had called her people herd creatures. But not everyone in the galaxy was sending gifts and smiles. The Dreth hegemony had watched the Crucible match from their embassy on the far side of Axis Prime, and they had watched it with cold reptilian eyes that held no admiration and no surprise, calculation, because the Dreth did not care about honor or sport or the ancient traditions of the Crucible. The Dreth cared about power, and humanity's sudden rise was a direct threat to the careful balance of power they had spent centuries building. The Dreth were a reptilian species, tall and heavily scaled with elongated skulls and vertical pupils that never seemed to blink. And they ruled the largest military empire in the eastern spiral arm of the galaxy, and they had maintained their dominance not through open war, but through quiet manipulation, bribes paid to Concord officials, intelligence networks that reached into every species government, and a long history of making problems disappear before anyone noticed they existed. Some, Ambassador Dreth Commandant Voss Keel, sat in his darkened embassy chamber and reviewed the file on humanity with his clawed fingers, drumming slowly on the armrest of his chair. And when his intelligence chief entered and stood at attention, Voss Keel spoke without looking up. "The humans cannot be allowed to establish themselves," he said, and his voice was a dry rasp, like scales dragging over stone. "If they gain military standing in the Concord, they will disrupt every arrangement we have built in the Eastern Arm, and I will not permit a species of mammals to undo 1,000 years of Dreth's strategy." His intelligence chief inclined his head and asked what should be done. "Activate the cell on Axis Prime," Voss Keel said. "We will use the Crucible's closing ceremony. Maximum casualties, human biological evidence planted at every blast point. And by the time the fires are out, the Concord will have no choice but to expel Earth and authorize containment measures against their homeworld." The plan was elegant in its cruelty. A series of concealed explosive devices hidden within the arena complex, set to detonate during the ceremony when representatives from every species would be gathered in one place, and the blast would kill hundreds, and the forensic evidence would point directly at humanity, and the Dreth would stand in the assembly hall and demand justice with the same forked tongues they used to whisper poison into the ears of lesser species. But the Dreth had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated how good humans were at finding things that were hidden. Corporal Yuki Tanaka was Fenrir's technical specialist, a quiet woman, the only female member of the support team attached to the task force, with a gift for electronic systems that bordered on the supernatural. And she had been running passive scans on the station's communication networks since the day Fenrir arrived, because Captain Reyes had taught every member of his unit the same lesson on their first day of training. Always assume someone is planning to kill you, and find them before they find you. Tanaka caught the first anomaly 3 days after the Crucible match, a burst of encrypted traffic on a frequency that did not belong to any registered species on the station, routed through a series of relays that bounced the signal through maintenance conduits in a pattern designed to avoid the station's standard monitoring systems. She traced it, broke the encryption in 6 hours using a decryption algorithm she had written herself, and brought the decoded messages to Captain Reyes at 0300 station time. And when he read them, his wolf smile disappeared entirely. "Get Nakamura," he said, "and get me a meeting with the War Matriarch." The meeting happened in a storage bay on the station's lowest level, far from any sensor grid. And when Sirith Dal arrived with Kalith at her side, she found Reyes waiting, with Nakamura and Tanaka, and a holographic display showing the Dreth communications laid out in sequence. Cyrith read the intercepted messages in silence, and her amber eyes grew darker with each line. And when she finished, she stood very still for a long time. "If this is true," she said, "then the Dreth are planning to murder hundreds of innocents and blame your species for it." "It is true," Tanaka said, and she showed the war matriarch the technical evidence, the frequency analysis, the decryption keys, the routing signatures that led directly back to the Dreth embassy. "And you are bringing this to me," Cyrith said, looking at Reyes, "instead of taking it to the Concord Security Council?" "The Concord Security Council has 3 members who receive regular payments from the Dreth hegemony," Reyes said. "If we go through official channels, the evidence will disappear, and we will be dead before the ceremony. And I am not interested in being dead." Cyrith almost smiled at that. "The Velkari have a non-interference pact with the Dreth," she said, and her voice was careful. "If I break it, there will be consequences for my people. Political consequences, economic consequences, possibly military consequences." "I know," Reyes said. "Then why are you here?" "Because you called me a warrior," Reyes said, and his voice was quiet and steady. "And on my world, warriors do not stand by while the innocent burn." The storage bay was silent for 10 seconds, and in that silence something shifted between the two of them. Something that went beyond species and biology, and the cold mathematics of galactic politics. And Cyrith Dahl made a decision that would change the course of history. "Caliph," she said, without turning, "assemble the Obsidian Veil. Full tactical configuration, black protocol, no records." The Obsidian Veil was Cyrith's personal guard, 12 of the deadliest Velkari warriors in existence, answerable only to her, and they had never once operated alongside another species. Until now. The joint operation launched at 0200 station time the following night, and it was a thing of terrible beauty. Infiltration. Tanaka disabled the Dreth Cell's communication network in the first 90 seconds, cutting them off from their embassy and from each other, while Nakamura coordinated the assault from a mobile command post hidden in the maintenance tunnels, feeding real-time sensor data to every operative through the human's Neuralink system. The Obsidian Veil handled the heavy work, smashing through reinforced doors, securing corridors, and creating a perimeter around the Dreth Cell's hideout that nothing could penetrate. It was the first time the two species had fought together, and it should have been awkward and clumsy and full of miscommunication. But instead, it was something that made every tactician who later reviewed the operation footage shake their head in disbelief. The humans and the Velkari complemented each other perfectly. Where the humans were subtle, the Velkari were overwhelming. Where the humans were precise, the Velkari were absolute. Together, they moved through the Dreth Cell like a blade through silk. The critical moment came in a narrow corridor on Sublevel 9, when a Dreth counter-assault team ambushed the lead element, and Sergeant Herrera and Blade Sister Caliph found themselves fighting back-to-back in a space too tight for either of them to maneuver properly. Herrera took the low angles, dropping to one knee and putting precise shots into the Dreth attacker's legs to bring them down. And Caliph took the high angles, her massive arms swinging over his head close enough to ruffle his hair, as she hammered the Dreth with blows that cracked their armored scales like eggshells. It lasted 45 seconds, and when it was over, there were 6 Dreth operatives on the ground, and Herrera and Caliph were both still standing, both bleeding, both breathing hard. Caliph looked down at him. "You are still very small," she said. Herrera looked up at her and grinned through a split lip. "And yet here we are, both still standing." Caliph laughed, and it was a full, genuine laugh that came from somewhere deep in her chest, and it echoed down the corridor like a sound the galaxy had never heard before. The sound of two species discovering that they were better together than either had ever been alone. By dawn, the Dreth Cell was neutralized, every operative captured, every explosive device recovered, every piece of evidence catalogued, and not a single civilian on the station had been harmed. The evidence was presented to the full Concord Assembly that afternoon, and it was irrefutable, and the Dreth ambassador was expelled from Axis Prime in disgrace. But as he walked out of the chamber, he passed Ambassador Voss and stopped, and leaned close enough for only her to hear. "You have made enemies you cannot imagine, little world," he hissed. Voss looked past him to the gallery where Task Force Fenrir stood in full dress uniform, injuries still visible, their backs straight, and beside them, for the first time in the history of the Galactic Concord, stood 12 Valkyrie warriors, shoulder to shoulder with another species, as if that was exactly where they belonged. "Maybe so," Elena said quietly, "but we have made friends you cannot imagine either." 6 months passed, and the galaxy settled into the uneasy calm that always follows a scandal. And most species went back to their own affairs, and tried to forget the embarrassment of the Dreth plot, and the strange, unlikely alliance between humanity and the Valkyrie. And for a while, it seemed like the universe might return to normal. Then the Dreth hegemony sent a war fleet to Erythea, and normal died screaming. Erythea was a neutral colony world in the buffer zone between Concord space and Dreth territory. A green and gentle planet that was home to 4 million civilians from a dozen different species, farmers and teachers and merchants and children, including a small human settlement of about 30,000 souls in the southern continent. And it had no military presence, and no defenses beyond a handful of orbital traffic control satellites, because nobody had ever imagined that anyone would be cruel enough to attack it. Dreth Commandant Voss Keel, now operating from his flagship in Dreth space with the full backing of the Hegemony's War Council, sent 47 warships to Erythea with orders that were simple and savage. Occupy the planet, subjugate the population, and make it clear to every species in the galaxy that defying the Dreth had consequences that even the Concord could not prevent. The distress signal reached Axis Prime at 1400 hours, and it reached Earth at 1403, and it reached the Valkyrie Warfleet at 1407, and within minutes the Galactic Concord convened an emergency session that immediately collapsed into chaos. Half the assembly wanted to send a peacekeeping force, half wanted to negotiate, a quarter wanted to pretend they had not heard the signal at all, and the combined effect was paralysis, the great machine of galactic governance grinding to a halt, while 4 million people watched Dreth warships descend through their sky like falling knives. Forces did not wait for permission. On Earth, Solcom activated its rapid response fleet, 12 ships, small and fast, and armed with weapons that human engineers had designed by studying every species' technology, and then figuring out how to make it meaner. And they launched from lunar orbit within 30 minutes of receiving the signal, burning hard for Erythea at speeds that their engines were not technically rated for, because the humans who built those engines had built-in margins that they had never told anyone about. And in deep space, 400 light-years from Erythea, the Valkyrie Warfleet changed course. War matriarch Cyrith Dahl stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Vel Murai, a dreadnought the size of a small moon, bristling with weapons that could crack a planet's crust. And she gave the order to break from their scheduled patrol route and make for Erythea at maximum burn. And when her navigation officer pointed out that they had no Concord authorization for military action in the buffer zone, Cyrith looked at her with those amber eyes and said, "Authorization is for politicians. We are warriors, and there are children on that planet." The Battle of Erythea began when the human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly inside the Dreth formation, which was something that no sane species would ever attempt, because the margin for error was measured in meters, and a miscalculation meant materializing inside a Dreth warship and ceasing to exist. The humans did not miscalculate. 12 human ships appeared in the gaps between the Dreth vessels, like wolves materializing inside a flock of sheep. And they opened fire before the Dreth even registered their arrival. and the first 3 minutes of the battle were pure chaos, as human frigates and destroyers wove through the Dreth formation at speeds that should not have been possible, their pilots pulling maneuvers that would have killed the crew of any ship not equipped with human-designed inertial dampeners. They were outnumbered 4-1, and they were outgunned by an even wider margin, and they did not care. Captain Reyes watched the space battle from the troop bay of a human dropship that was screaming through Arithia's atmosphere at 8 times the speed of sound, because while the fleet kept the Dreth warships busy in orbit, Task Force Fenrir was going to the surface. They hit the ground running, literally, because the dropship did not land so much as skim the terrain at low altitude, while the soldiers jumped from the open ramps and rolled and were on their feet and moving before the ship had even pulled away. And behind them came 5 more dropships carrying the rest of Fenrir and a company of standard human marines. And behind them, falling through the atmosphere like burning meteors, came the Velkari. Sireth Dal's fleet had arrived 17 minutes after the humans. Dreadnoughts engaged the Dreth warships in orbit, and the difference between a Velkari dreadnought and a Dreth cruiser turned out to be roughly the same as the difference between a hammer and a glass window. Her ground forces deployed alongside the humans in the first joint combat drop in galactic history. The fighting on the surface was brutal and desperate and wonderful in the terrible way that only war can be. The Dreth had already landed occupation forces, thousands of heavily armed reptilian soldiers who had begun rounding up civilians and herding them into containment zones. And when Task Force Fenrir hit the first containment zone outside the human settlement, they found 300 human and alien civilians huddled together in a fenced compound guarded by 50 Dreth soldiers, and among the civilians were children. Mateo Reyes saw the children, and something happened behind his eyes that his men recognized, because they had seen it before, on other battlefields on other worlds, and it always meant the same thing. It meant that the wolf was no longer smiling, and that mercy had left the building. Fenrir dismantled the Dreth Guard force in 4 minutes. They moved through the compound like a natural disaster with a conscience, precise and devastating, and utterly without hesitation. And when the last Dreth soldier fell, Mateo knelt tomato beside a small alien child, a fragile insectoid creature no bigger than a human toddler, who was shaking with terror, and he spoke to it softly in a language it did not understand. But the tone was universal, and the child stopped shaking and reached for him with its tiny translucent arms. Sireth Dal arrived at the compound with her personal guard minutes later, and she found Mateo organizing the freed civilians into groups, humans helping aliens, aliens helping humans, anyone who could carry a weapon being handed one and shown how to use it. And she watched him rally broken, terrified people from a dozen different species into something that resembled a fighting force through nothing more than the sheer unbreakable conviction in his voice, and the refusal in his eyes to accept defeat as a possibility. She stood there in her battle armor with her war blade in her hand, and she thought, this is why they survived their death world, not because they are the strongest, or the fastest, or the most advanced, but because they make everyone around them stronger, because something in their nature refuses to let the people beside them give up, and that is the most dangerous weapon any species has ever evolved. The battle raged for 9 hours. Human ships in orbit fought with a recklessness that the Dreth could not match, because the Dreth fought to win, and the humans fought like they had already decided that losing was not something their species did. And there is a vast difference between a soldier who wants to win and a soldier who has simply removed the possibility of losing, the concept of defeat from their understanding of reality. Velkari dreadnoughts hammered the Dreth fleet from the flanks, exploiting every gap the humans created, and one by one the Dreth warships broke and burned and fell. On the ground, human marines and Velkari shock troops fought side by side through the streets of Arithia's cities, and the partnership that had been born in a storage bay on Axis Prime and forged in a midnight raid against a Dreth cell was now tempered in the fire of open war, and it held. It more than held. It sang. The Dreth fleet broke at the 11th hour, the surviving ships scattering into faster-than-light retreat, and the occupation forces on the ground surrendered when they realized that no extraction was coming, and Erythia was saved. 4 million civilians were alive, because 12 human ships and 1 Velkari warfleet had refused to wait for a committee to finish arguing. The Galactic Concord convened 3 days later, and the assembly hall was packed tighter than it had been on the day Cyrith Dahl had mocked humanity. And this time it was Cyrith who stood at the central podium. But the words she spoke were very different from the ones she had spoken all those months ago. She stood in her full ceremonial armor, with the scars of the Battle of Erythia still visible on her face, and she looked out at the assembled representatives of 100 species. And when she spoke, her voice filled the chamber the way it always did, like thunder rolling across a dark sky. "We laughed at Earth," she said. "I laughed at Earth. I stood in this very hall and called them soft-boned herd creatures, and my warriors laughed with me, and many of you laughed too, because it is easy to mock what you do not understand." She paused, and her amber eyes swept the gallery. "Then their sons walked into our arenas, and they fought through pain that would have broken any one of us. Knocked them down, they stood back up. And they did this not because they felt no pain, but because they felt all of it, and chose to stand anyway." Her voice dropped lower, and every being in the hall leaned forward. "At Erythia, I watched a human captain carry an alien child to safety, while his own bones were cracking under his skin. And I watched human soldiers arm civilians they had never met, and teach them to fight in a language none of them shared. And I watched 12 human ships throw themselves at a fleet 4 times their size, because somewhere on the planet below there were children who needed them." She straightened to her full 7-foot height. "I am Cyrith Dahl, war matriarch of the Velkari, and I tell you now what I should have said the day they first walked into this hall. The sons of Earth are not our inferiors. They are not our amusement. They are not the punchline of our jokes. They are our equals, and any species that threatens them threatens us all." The hall erupted, and the vote that followed was unanimous. Earth was granted full military standing and a permanent seat on the Concord Security Council, and the Velkari and humanity signed the Pact of Iron and Blood, the first formal military alliance between humans and an alien species, sealed with a handshake between Cyrith Dahl and Captain Mateo Reyes, that was broadcast to 1 trillion beings across the stars. Months later, long after the speeches were done and the treaties were signed, and the galaxy had begun to adjust to the new reality that humanity was here to stay, a new banner was hung outside humanity's arena bay on Axis Prime. It was not a death shroud. It bore a combined emblem, the Velkari warblade crossed with a human wolf's head, and beneath it, etched in both languages, was a single phrase: "Forged together." Caliph and Herrera stood beneath it on the day it was unveiled, both of them scarred, both of them tired, smiling in the way that only people who have bled together can smile. Caliph punched his shoulder hard enough to stagger him sideways. He punched her armored thigh hard enough to bruise his knuckles. Neither said a word, because they did not need to, because some things are older than language and deeper than words, and the bond between warriors who have stood back to back in the dark and refused to fall is one of them. And somewhere out in the vast black silence of the galaxy, the stars burned on, and they did not care about politics or species or the petty arguments of mortal creatures. But if they had cared, they might have noticed that the small blue world called Earth was no longer alone, and that its sons had walked into the void and found not enemies, but family, and that the galaxy would never be the same again.